Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is May the 18th, and it's a Sabbath here at the congregation of Yahweh in Panama City. It's a beautiful day. It's always a beautiful day in Panama City. Today my message is going to be about something that happened since we observed Passover in the days of unleavened bread not too long ago. It's essentially two things. One is the question that we in this congregation hear often, and that question was, why are we observing these feast days a month later than others? Sometimes we're a month before others. The other thing that happened was I was forwarded an email from someone that I didn't know, but since it involved a calendar matter, they thought that I might be interested in it, which I was, because in pursuing that, there's been some interesting things that have been revealed. Now, we all have talked about calendar matters, and before I had given a sermon up here and made it into an article which subsequently appeared on the internet. The title of it was How the High Priest Determined the Scriptural Calendar. And I didn't think that there would be a great deal of discussion about this, because I thought my premise would be strong enough to withstand anybody attacking something that was this simple. And the premise was that religious leaders should know why and how the high priest at the temple in Jerusalem determined the scriptural calendar. That seems pretty straightforward. The why, because it's a prerequisite for correctly keeping the weekly and annual holy convocations commanded in Leviticus 23, and the how, to correctly know when they occur. Now this, folks, is a responsibility of the religious leader. But I point out that few denominations observe the weekly Sabbath, even though it's a holy convocation, and it's also the fourth commandment. But to drop down a little bit, I felt that the responsibility for determining the scriptural calendar is obligatory upon the leader of any congregation which uses the Bible. Now, of course, that broad statement includes people who are not sacred namers, and yet the responsibility is still there. It's a responsibility of the leader to ensure the congregation knows the correct day to observe a holy convocation, and that includes how to correctly count to the Feast of Weeks. And you will commonly talk to people who will be going to service tomorrow on Sunday, and all they talk about is Pentecost. They don't ever talk about Feast of Weeks or Day of Sabbath, Shavuot. Doesn't enter into their vocabulary because they're principally New Testament type of, quote, Christians, unquote. Well, it's also my feeling that all males of a congregation, especially the head of a household, must be able to determine the scriptural calendar correctly, and all adult members should be familiar with the rationale. Well, I'm proud to say that those people in this congregation who are adults and not astronomers have on occasion asked about certain points, and I've been pleased to explain those points again and again, even though I feel that you all have had the subject given to you enough to where a year needs to go by. Well, I received an email, and the email said, in effect, thought you might be interested in it. looks like this author has invented another way of keeping the scriptural calendar. And so I responded to the person that sent this to me, who is the author of this email? And I was given his email address, and I sent him a pretty innocuous email. I said, I would appreciate knowing your step-by-step rationale for determining the scriptural year. Thank you in advance for your courtesy. Sincerely, Anthony Gaudiano. That's pretty simple, pretty sweet, pretty short. And I got back a quite lengthy explanation. I had requested his rationale, and he was kind enough to promptly send it. And I appreciated that fact. And I wrote him a thank you email, and I attach a copy of my paper, How the High Priest Determined the Scriptural Calendar. Since then, he's responded about that. But before I get ahead of myself, let me read you his response to my request that he give us the rationale for how he determined the scriptural calendar. His name is Miller, Gerald Miller, and Gary Miller, rather, and he's with the International Congregation of Yahweh in Pocahontas, Arkansas. He says, thank you for writing. As to your question regarding the calendar, explanation which follows will clearly show how these times are determined. I should point out that the calendar must be derived from definite scriptures, not Jewish tradition. The dates on our websites are based on the biblical derivation of Yahweh's calendar. This year, 2013, is a late year due to the way the new moons fall relative to the cardinal, in parentheses, biblical, into parentheses, points of the year. October 26th, in parentheses, end of the year, close parentheses, and February 15th, parentheses, head of the year, close parentheses. The Bible does not use the vernal equinox to set the holy days. Now, as I read this, things are going to pop up to you as they popped up to me. And you're going to start to suspect some of the things that he's saying may be different from what you know and believe. It says, to determine the first month of the year, the Bible example/precedent shows the new moon of the seventh month can fall no later than October the 5th. The new moon of the seventh month can fall no later than October the 5th. I have been unable to determine how he came up with that, and you're probably wondering about it too. So this is clear from Nehemiah 6:15, parentheses, wall of Jerusalem finished October the 2nd, 445 BC, close parentheses, and taken with Nehemiah 7:73, parentheses, shows Israel in their dwellings when the seventh month came after the wall was finished, close parentheses. Combine this with Nehemiah 8:2, which shows the first day of the seventh month came again. This was after the wall was finished on October the 7th, 445 BC. So you get the picture? He is relating the method of determining the calendar to when the walls were rebuilt in Jerusalem. Now this was, recall, after the Babylonian captivity, and it was in the time of the prophet Ezra and Nehemiah. So instead of looking at the first year to begin his calendar, he's looking at the seventh year. Now, Jewish calendars today, they have the head of the year as 1 Tishri. It's the seventh month. So if you right there were to stop and do as I did, go online and try to find out what was the basis for the Jews establishing the 7th month as the beginning of their calendar, as it is right now. They begin their calendar in the 7th month on the day of Tishri. Well, it turns out that there's a few Jewish authors, and they tell you that they're a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary and so forth, and they tell you straight out that this is the beginning of the civil year, not the scriptural year, and that the scriptural year is the 1st month, and they frequently use Nisan, and so they know it. And it's not the beginning of the year of the calendar that they have right now. The religious calendar is not based on Scripture. It's based upon man's traditions. It's a civil year, not the religious year. And I'm not blaming them for that. It's just how it happens to be. But what seems like reinforced the decision to do that was the completion of the wall back in 445 BC. It also was influenced by the completion of crops and the harvesting of crops and things like that. The purely economic and common sense reasons that could be used to justify it. If you look at some of these authors who will entertain comments to what they have written, you'll see people in there who respond have no concept whatsoever about the calendar. Why, how, nothing. They just, I guess they don't have a life, and so they happen to feel compelled to respond to anybody that will accept comments to anything that's on the internet. But then occasionally you'll get one who really does know, and you can tell in their words structure that, it's like, my goodness, this is so common. Sigh. That this has to be repeated again. One guy even wrote in parentheses SIGH, close parentheses. Okay. Together with these scriptures reveal the first day of the 7th month had to fall after October the 2nd, 445 BC, when the wall of Jerusalem was finished. The closest new moon following October the 2nd, 445 BC occurred on October the 5th, that year at 8:57 a.m. Universal Time. Now this shows that he has utilized some computer software or tables from observatory like the USNO or Royal Observatory. So he does know that these things happen at exact times. It says, this is the biblical precedence for the latest occurrence of the new moon of the 7th month. By counting backwards from October the 5th new moon gives the new moon of the 1st month of the year. Counting backwards. Now, put yourself in the position of Aaron right now, this instant. Put yourself in the position of Aaron. The Almighty Yahweh has just told Moses, you are to anoint and consecrate Aaron and his sons. Anoint and consecrate Aaron and his son. Aaron as high priest and the son as ministering priest. And they would be stand-ins for when one of them of the seed of Aaron would become the high priest. And only the seed of Aaron could be the high priest. So, all right, now Aaron has put on the garb that is detailed in the scriptures. Moses had poured oil on his head, and run down his beard and onto his garment. And he is now high priest. And a little further on, the Almighty Yahweh tells Moses to tell Aaron, tell your brother Aaron, he shall not at all times come into the Holy of Holies, lest he die. Some Bibles say that he die not. And that's where a lot of people's reading stops, right there. To continue on with the reading, of course, it says, that he is in a cloud, the Almighty Yahweh is in a cloud on the mercy seat. And just the presence of Aaron or anybody else would die. Anybody else except Moses. So, not at all times means that he does not have free access to just go walking behind the veil, either on purpose or accidentally, because he would die. Not as punishment, but because of the presence of the Almighty Yahweh. Not because of punishment, but because of the presence of the Almighty Yahweh. And then he goes on to say, the Bible goes on to say, that Aaron is to make atonement for himself and for his household, and he is personally to make sacrifices. Now, these sacrifices were commonly done by the Levitical priesthood. They were like the worker bees. Their reward was ministering to the Almighty Yahweh. The sons of the high priest, if he had sons, their purpose was to do things like put incense on the incense burners, to light the menorah at evening, and then clean it in the morning, put it out, clean it in the morning, refill the oil, and things like that. But on the Day of Atonement, Moses himself, the high priest, in this case Aaron, was to perform the sacrifices himself. Well, he was to do it on the Day of Atonement. If he went into the Holy of Holies on any other day than the day when he was told to go in, he would die. And it says that on the day when Aaron goes into the Holy of Holies behind the veil, that nobody else is to be in the tent. Nobody else is to be in the tabernacle. Why? Well, the obvious reason is that when he pulled the flap back or went in, somebody might see the cloud, and that would be their death. So it was incumbent on Aaron to go in on the right day. If he went on the day before or the day after or 30 days before or 29 days after, whatever. If he went on the wrong day, then he would die. Therefore, determination of the scriptural calendar was something that he did personally. He did not delegate such an important thing, such a life or death matter, to another person. Would we? Would we? My goodness, I have, in my old age, problems doing simple mathematics. I wouldn't delegate it to somebody else who would make a mistake. But now that you put yourself in Aaron's place, do you start to understand the great importance that the scriptural calendar was? And so we have to think in terms of, how did he do it? What did Aaron know, and when did he know it? That's the common thing you hear on the news all the time. What did so-and-so know, and when did they know it? Well, we know that Aaron knew, as I've mentioned before, that there were 3 celestial objects, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they were used for 4 purposes: for signs, for appointed times, and for days, and for years. That's what Aaron had. That's what he had. Well, one of the signs surely was the spring equinox. Now, the word Tekufa is frequently used because there is no direct translation for the word equinox. Hebrew does have a word for spring. It generally refers to water that's coming out of the ground, things like that, or vegetation which is coming up out of the earth, but not as a season. Israel had roughly 2 seasons, from the autumnal equinox to the spring equinox. The weather got increasingly wet, rainy, cold. That's when they did the plowing and the planting. And then after the spring equinox, the temperature was increasing. the barley grew, they had the latter rains, and there was harvesting, and there was gathering. And so there was agricultural activity principally from the spring equinox to the autumnal equinox, what we would call the spring equinox and the autumnal equinox. So now that's in microcosm the way things are pretty obvious. And they were pretty obvious to Aaron. Now when Aaron determined the scriptural calendar, there were no walls in Jerusalem. Aaron was born, and Moses, because Aaron was 3 years older than Moses. Aaron was born, and Moses, years and years and years after the pyramids at Giza were built. And one of the pyramids at Giza, the side of it, is exactly east and west, such that on the equinox, spring or summer, spring or autumn, as the sun rises, it rises right along, the shadow goes right along the side of that equinox pyramid. So here was Moses, who was surely well educated because he was raised in a royal household. Remember the daughter that took him from the river, and surely he passed on the Egyptian knowledge about astronomy to his brother Moses, if his brother did not already know it. And for you folks, these little details are important because they reflect the knowledge at the time. The pyramids at Giza are arranged the same as the stars in the belt of Orion, the constellation of Orion. The same. Bing, bing, bing. So knowledge of astronomy above seeing the moon was surely taught to Moses, who passed it on to his brother. And this information, plus what Aaron surely knew, was what he used to determine the calendar. Simple. You look for the day when the shadow was straight and a straight line. He knew that was the spring equinox after he had witnessed green things sprouting, leaves and barley maturing and lambing, and the Jordan overflowing because of melting snow, because the temperature had increased from the winter increasing toward the summer. And the snow on the peaks would see that increasing temperature melt, and the Jordan would overflow. Still does so. Same thing today. Let me continue on here. He says, furthermore, this shows the Feast of Tabernacles cannot end later than October the 26th. That date, according to Exodus 23:16, must be at the end of the year. This is a cardinal ending point of the year and constant date, which does not change from year to year. Does anybody know of a constant date that doesn't change from year to year? But this is what the man has stated. Now remember, he's the leader of a congregation. He stands right here in his congregation, and he misleads his congregation, apparently. That's a very risky thing to do. This year, 2013, the seventh new moon falls very early on October the 5th, shortly after midnight. Well, if we take a look at our calendar, we don't have these same numbers. And I'm going to explain why his numbers are different. Certainly within the time frame of the biblical precedent, again, he's reverting back to the walls, 445 BC, when it fell about 9 hours later at 8:57 a.m. on the morning of October the 5th, 445. Aside from the fact that the Romans divided up the calendar and have named the months, he doesn't add the information that this would have been Julian time reckoning. because it was in 1548, that the calendar went from Julian to Gregorian to pick up the error in the time. By counting new moons backwards from October the 5th. Now, can you see Aaron doing that? Counting moons backwards? Of course not. Brings us to the new moon of the first month of the year. New moon of the first month of the year on April the 10th. Well, we have April the 12th. And we have derived it by simply noting when the new moon crescent occurs. He's counting backwards 7 months. Now, which figure is likely, which method is likely to have the smallest error? The one with the greatest span or the one with the smallest span? Well, we think, of course, if you can see it, that's when it happens. The people who look through the conjunction, of course, can't see it. And that's why we feel that the way they're doing it is not correct. But we're all brothers, even though we have different opinions. I'll continue. The Jews do not add a 13th month to their calendar this year, so that the first month of the year starts on March the 12th, a month earlier than the first biblical month. The starting of a calendar, whoever it is, on March the 12th is patently incorrect for one very simple reason. It's before the spring equinox. It's in the winter. The scriptural calendar cannot begin in the winter. You know, the Almighty Yahweh says in the scriptures, this is the first month of the year for you. And then he even names it. Now, here's an interesting one. February the 15th date for the head of the year is determined by counting the same number of days before the midpoint of the year, parentheses, the summer solstice, see Exodus 34:22, close parentheses, as October the 26th. Well, that may be a little bit hard to visualize, so I brought this in to make it a little bit easier as to what he's talking about. Now let's refer, for example, he's talking about the month of February. The month of February. This is March the 21st, going counterclockwise. He's talking in the winter, before the spring equinox. He's calling this the beginning of the year. And he's talking about over here as the end of the year. So it's not symmetrical, but that's what he has. Now I went to his webpage because after I got to looking at this, and there were so many things, and I've just mentioned a few, that just didn't seem logical, didn't seem, well, certainly different from what we do, but it just, what was the basis for it? He shows a picture of them observing the days of unleavened bread. They have a table there, and it looks like there's 6 or 8 people there. And the table is out in the yard, kind of like. And it, you know, people all nicely dressed. After all, it is being done in honor of the fact that this is the Almighty Yahweh's day. And so they dress accordingly. But the congregation must be small. And he seems to be very dictatorial about how things should be. Again, they're brothers, sisters, and we just have a different opinion. February 15th for the date of the year is determined by counting the same number of days before the midpoint of the year, the summer solstice, as October the 26th is after the summer solstice. So he's talking about counting this way from the summer solstice. Now, to my knowledge, the scripture doesn't talk about a summer solstice accounting or anything of that nature. A lot of this has to do, again, with referencing back to the days when the walls were rebuilt. So, I just use this as an example. I have collected rationales from various sacred name groups. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One is a sanity check to make sure that I'm not missing anything and have not misled anyone. But also to keep abreast of the rationale that's used by others. And I will tell you that I have made probably 10 or so requests, and I have received maybe 2. The other ones that I don't receive, I can discern pretty much what their rationale is, and they fall into basically 2 groups. There are people who follow the conjunctions, and there's people who follow the new moon crescent. Again, when you do read the rationale of people like this guy, ask yourself this question: what did Aaron do? What tools did he have at his disposal? He had the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's what he had: the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that's what he used. The walls didn't exist at that time. And if you look at the rationale that a lot of people will hold up as being very authoritative and correct, you will find, frequently conjunction of the moon. Well, the conjunction of the moon was not the interval from one to the other, was not even determined roughly until the year 330 BC. 330 BC. And Moses, Aaron, and so forth were dead thousands of years before that. So anyone who's advocating the conjunction as the way to determine the scriptural year should go back and say, did Moses know about the conjunction of the moon? What one will find is that the Hebrews, more than any other, seem to have less scholars for the stars, the sun, the moon, planets, and so forth than anyone else. The Babylonians could calculate and predict the conjunction of planets, which you can barely see. They're just little specks of light. But visually, over the years, they developed mathematics to calculate a triple conjunction of planets. They could calculate tides. Their calendar was based on the first new moon crescent. Guess what? After the spring equinox. Now, as I've said during the presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago, out of something like 8,900 continuous records of the new moon, citing the new moon, there are 4 which do not fit that criteria, and those 4 are considered to be errors in writing. But 8,000 versus 4, percentage-wise, it's like background noise. Now, Aaron could look up and he could see the first new moon crescent. So could all of the people, all of the shepherds and so forth that had flocks and herds at that time. We know they had flocks and herds in the Exodus because it tells us that they had much cattle and flocks and herds and stuff. So these people were close to the land. They used the tools which the Almighty has given mankind, and that was what Aaron used. Did any of the high priests afterwards change it? Item number 1, Aaron did it correctly. Why? Because we know he died at an old age, he didn't die from going into the Holy of Holies on the wrong day. And there's no record of any other high priest or person that held that office having died in the Holy of Holies. So whatever it was that Aaron used to determine the scriptural year was done by all the successive high priests. Now, there's no hard written evidence that I can give you to do that, except for the fact that there's no record of Aaron dying in the Holy of Holies or any of the high priests after him. And this included, incidentally, his son. You know, he had 4 sons. 2 were disobedient and died, and one of the other 2 sons became high priest when Aaron died. And in fact, the Bible even talks about the garments were placed upon the other son. Well, I wanted to mention this to you today simply because I firmly believe, and as I stand here today in all sincerity, tell you that I'm somewhat responsible for the methodology that we use, the rationale. And I want you to know that I scrupulously validate this information almost on a monthly basis. And therefore, I'm strongly confident that this congregation is doing it the same way that Aaron did. Thank you.